The rain fell on Redemption Gulch, not with the clean, life-giving promise of spring, but with the cold, mean persistence of a debt collector. It turned the street into a thick, clinging soup of mud that sucked at the boots of the few men who braved the downpour and coated the boardwalks in a slick, treacherous film. The sky was the color of a day-old bruise, low and heavy, pressing the smoke from the chimneys back down into the narrow gaps between the raw timber buildings. It was a miserable day in a town that had long forgotten the meaning of its own name. From his place under the broad awning of the general store, Abel watched the street. He was a man carved from the same hard granite as the mountains that loomed to the north. His face a landscape of quiet sorrows and enduring strength. He rarely came to town, descending from his high country ranch only when necessity dictated. Today, it was salt, flour, and a new axe head. He had gotten what he needed and was waiting for a break in the deluge that never seemed to come, his canvas sacks resting at his feet. His gaze was drawn, as was the gaze of every other person in town, to the figure standing alone across the street. She stood beside the water trough in front of the saloon, a place of loud curses and spilled whiskey, yet she seemed to occupy a different world entirely. She was Chinese, a rarity in this part of the territory, and she was trying to sell flowers. Not real flowers, for nothing so delicate could survive this place, but blossoms crafted from paper, their vibrant reds and yellows a defiant splash of color against the monochrome gray of the day. He held them out in a small basket, the rain plastering her dark fine hair to her scalp and soaking the thin silk of her dress. The dress itself was an act of defiance, a garment of pale blue embroidered with cranes, now stained with mud at the hem and clinging to her slender frame. It was a dress for a warm evening in a distant civilized land, not for a cold downpour in a mining town at the edge of nowhere. She did not shiver, or if she did, she held it inside. She simply stood still and silent, her expression a mask of profound, unyielding dignity. Abel knew her story, or at least the town's version of it, which was likely a twisted and cruel facsimile of the truth. She had been brought in on the last stage by Bartholomew Thorne, the man who owned the mine, bank, and half the souls in Redemption Gulch. She was to be his wife, a pretty exotic ornament for his new ostentatious house on the hill. But the whispers had started within a week. She was not docile. She was not compliant. She spoke a clear, educated English that unnerved him and looked at him not with the deference he'd paid for, but with an unnerving, intelligent clarity. Yesterday, Thorne had cast her out. He had dragged her to the center of town and declared their contract void. He called her insolent and barren, a bad investment, and left her on the street with nothing but the clothes she wore. He had made a public spectacle of his power, turning her humiliation into a lesson for anyone who might forget who held the reins in this town. Since then, she had been a ghost, drifting from one storefront to the next, ignored, pitied, and scorned. The door to the saloon swung open, spilling a wave of yellow light and raucous noise onto the street. Two miners, drunk and emboldened, stumbled out. They saw her, and a slow, malicious grin spread across the face of the larger man. He lurched toward her, reaching for one of the paper flowers. His clumsy fingers fumbled. The basket tipped, spilling its colorful contents into the sucking mud. The man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Look at that," he slurred. "Pretty things ain't meant for the mud." The woman, May, did not react. She simply looked down at the ruined flowers, her face unreadable. She bent slowly, her movements graceful even in the cold and the wet, and began to pick them up one by one, the mud clinging to her fingers. From across the street, Abel felt a slow, cold anger begin to burn in his gut. It was a feeling he hadn't felt in a long time, an old, familiar heat. He saw the waste of it, the casual cruelty. He saw the sheriff, a man named Calloway, whose spying was owned by Thorne, step out of his office and watch the scene with a lazy disinterest. Calloway's only move was to call out to her, "You best move along, girl, or causing a disturbance." She straightened up, the ruined, muddy paper clutched in her hand. She looked at the sheriff, then at the miners, and then her eyes swept the street, passing over the faces in the windows, the men on the boardwalks. They were faces of indifference, of mild curiosity, of contempt. Not one offered help. She was utterly terrifyingly alone. Her gaze finally settled on Abel, standing in the shadows of the store's porch. For a moment their eyes met across the muddy expanse. He saw no plea in her look, only a deep, bottomless exhaustion, and a flicker of something that looked like resolve. Abel pushed himself off the post he'd been leaning against. The decision was not a thought, but an impulse, a deep-seated refusal to let this ugliness stand. He had seen enough of the world's indifference. He had lived in its shadow for 5 years, ever since the fever took his Sarah and their boy, leaving him with a silence that filled every corner of his cabin and his heart. He did not move to offer comfort. Comfort was a language he no longer spoke. He moved to offer a solution. He picked up his sacks, slung them over his shoulder, and walked down the steps. His boots made a heavy, determined sound on the wet wood. He crossed the street, the mud grabbing at his heels, his path cleaving a straight line through the rain. The drunken miners shuffled back, their bravado shrinking under his cold, steady gaze. Sheriff Calloway tensed, his hand hovering near his pistol, but he did nothing. Everyone in Redemption Gulch knew Abel. They knew him as the man who kept to himself, the man who had buried his own family and then buried himself in work. They did not know what he was capable of. He stopped in front of her. She was smaller up close, yet her stillness made her seem rooted to the very ground. The rain dripped from the ends of her dark hair and traced paths down her pale cheeks. She did not look away, her dark eyes searching his face, trying to read the intent behind the harsh lines and the graying stubble. Abel was not a man for many words. He looked at the ruined flowers in her hand, then back at her face. He had a problem. His cabin was a place of work, not a home. It was functional, but the dust gathered in the corners, and his meals were whatever was fastest. He needed help, she needed a refuge. The transaction was clean. "I need a cook," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. "My cabin is warm. There's food." He did not offer pity. He did not offer charity. He offered a bargain, a simple exchange of labor for shelter. It was the only language he had left, the language of practicality. May stared at him, her mind racing. She had seen this man before, on his rare trips to town. He was always alone, his eyes holding a distance that kept the world at bay. She had seen the cruelty, the eyes of the miners, the cowardice in the sheriff's, the cold calculation in Thorne's. In this man's eyes, she saw something else. It was not kindness, not yet, but it was a solid thing. It was like looking at the unyielding granite of the mountains themselves. There was no deceit in him. She looked down at her muddy hands, at the pathetic ruined paper flowers that represented the last of her hope for an independent survival in this town. She looked back up at him. She gave a single sharp nod. The acceptance was as stark and simple as his offer. Abel felt a knot he didn't know was in his chest loosen slightly. He turned without another word and walked toward the general store. She hesitated for only a second before following, her steps light and silent behind his heavy tread. The town watched, a collective murmur rippling through the rain-soaked air. Inside the store, the pot-bellied stove radiated a welcome warmth. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, a man whose cynicism was tempered by a grudging decency, watched them enter, his eyes wide with curiosity. Abel ignored him. He walked to the back of the store where the boots were lined up. "Size," he said to her, not looking back. She pointed to a small, sturdy pair of leather work boots. He took them down, along with a pair of thick woolen socks, and placed them on the counter. He then picked out a heavy oilcloth cloak, the kind that could turn back the worst of a mountain storm. "Put them on," he commanded softly. She moved behind a stack of barrels, and a moment later her ruined silk slippers were left on the floor as she emerged wearing the boots and wrapping the cloak around her shoulders. The transformation was immediate. The fragile, displaced woman was gone, replaced by someone prepared for the harshness of the land. She looked more at home in the rough gear than she ever had in the fine silk. Abel paid Henderson in coin, the clink of the silver loud in the quiet store. Henderson packed the slippers into a small paper parcel without being asked. As Abel turned to leave, Henderson spoke, his voice low. "You know Thorne ain't gonna like this, Abel. He considers her his property." "She's not property," Abel replied, his voice flat and final. He picked up his supply sacks, handed the small parcel to May, and they walked back out into the rain. They left town on his wagon, the two mules leaning into their collars as they pulled the heavy load up the winding track that led away from Redemption Gulch and into the high country. Abel sat straight-backed, his hands firm on the reins, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. May sat beside him, a silent, cloaked figure. The town, with its whispers and its judgments, fell away behind them, swallowed by the rain and the mist. They rode into the vast, lonely wilderness, two solitary souls bound by a simple, desperate bargain, heading toward a shared solitude. The journey to Abel's homestead was a long, slow climb into a different world. The rain gradually thinned to a fine mist as the wagon ascended, leaving the muddy squalor of the town for the clean, sharp scent of pine and wet earth. The road was little more than a pair of ruts carved into the mountainside, with a steep drop on one side and a wall of dark rock on the other. They traveled in silence, the only sounds the rhythmic plodding of the mules, the creak of the wagon wheels, and the whisper of the wind through the towering pines. Mai watched the landscape unfold, her eyes taking in the raw, untamed beauty of it. It was a brutal country, vast and indifferent, but it was honest in its brutality. It did not pretend to be something it was not, unlike the men in the town below. She clutched the small parcel containing her slippers, the last vestige of her former life. She felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. For the first time in months, she did not feel watched. Abel felt her stillness beside him. He was acutely aware of her presence, a small, quiet weight in the vast emptiness of his life. He had not shared his wagon seat with another living soul in 5 years. The silence between them was not awkward, it was a shared language. He had lived with silence for so long it had become a part of him, but this silence was different. It was occupied. As dusk began to bleed into the gray sky, they arrived. The homestead was nestled in a small high meadow, protected on three sides by a thick stand of aspen and pine, with a commanding view of the valley below. The cabin was a solid, unadorned structure of hand-hewn logs, chinked with mud and stone. A barn stood nearby, equally sturdy, and a series of corrals snaked out from it. It was a place built for survival, not for comfort. It was a fortress of solitude. Abel brought the wagon to a halt and climbed down. "We're here," he said, the words seeming inadequate. He helped her down, his hand briefly touching hers. Her skin was cold, but her grip was firm. He led the way to the cabin, pushing the heavy door open. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of wood smoke and dust. A single large room served as kitchen, living space, and bedroom. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean but cold. A rough-hewn table and two chairs stood in the center. A bed, neatly made with a thick wool blanket, occupied one corner, and a small empty rocking chair sat beside it, a silent, heartbreaking sentinel. It lacked a woman's touch, Sarah's touch, and the emptiness of that loss was a physical presence in the room. Abel moved with an economy born of long habit. He lit the lantern, its yellow glow pushing back the gloom, and then set about building a fire. He did not give her orders, but simply began the rhythm of his life, assuming she would find her place in it. He showed her just outside the door, the neatly stacked wood pile, and the small pantry stocked with sacks of flour, beans, and salted meat. "The loft is for you," he said, gesturing to a ladder that led to a small space under the eaves. "There are blankets." May nodded, taking it all in. She removed her damp cloak and hung it on a peg by the door. Without a word of instruction, she began to work. While Abel went to tend to the mules, she took the broom and swept the floor, her movements efficient and thorough. She found a pail and a rag and wiped the dust from the table and the single window. She unpacked the supplies Abel had bought, arranging them neatly in the pantry. She moved with a quiet purpose that began to subtly reshape the space around her. When Abel returned, the cabin was warmer from the roaring fire, and the air smelled of coffee. He stopped in the doorway, surprised. He was used to doing everything himself, to the relentless solitary cycle of chores. He looked at her, standing by the fire, her silhouette framed by the flames. She had brought an order to his space in less than an hour, a quiet domesticity he had forgotten existed. He sat at the table, and she poured him a cup of coffee. She then began to prepare a meal, moving around a small kitchen space with an innate skill. She found flour, salt pork, and dried beans, and soon had a stew simmering and biscuits baking in the Dutch oven. The aroma filled the cabin, a warm, savory scent that was a stark contrast to the smell of fried bacon and stale bread he was used to. They ate in silence. The stew was rich and flavorful, the biscuits light and perfect. It was the best meal Abel had eaten in 5 years. He ate slowly, the simple act of sharing a well-cooked meal at his own table feeling foreign and profound. He watched her across the table. She ate with a delicate precision, her posture erect, her dignity intact. She was not a servant. She was a partner in this silent contract. In the days that followed, a new reality settled over the homestead. A quiet, unspoken routine was established, a dance of two solitary people learning to share a space. He would rise before dawn, and she would already have the fire going and coffee ready. He would go out to mend fences, check on his small herd of cattle, or chop wood. his days governed by the relentless demands of the land. He would return at noon to find a plate of food waiting for him on the table. She transformed the interior of the cabin. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed. She washed the window until the mountain light streamed in clear and bright. She found his mending kit and began repairing his worn clothes, her stitches small and impossibly neat. One day, he came in to find she had taken one of the empty flour sacks, washed it until it was soft and white, and sewn it into a curtain for the window. It was a small, simple thing, but it changed the room entirely, softening its hard edges. Communication was minimal, a language of gestures and actions. He would leave a brace of rabbits on the porch, and that night they would have a savory stew. She would notice his axe handle was loose, and she would leave a small bowl of warm water and a wedge for him to fix it. He went to town once and came back, not only with supplies, but also with a small bag containing needles, thread, and a bolt of plain, sturdy calico cloth. He left it on the table without a word. The next week, she was wearing a simple, practical dress she had sewn, and she had used the scraps to make new cloths for the kitchen. He began to learn things about her through observation. He saw the way she would pause in her work to watch a hawk circle in the sky, her face filled with a quiet longing. He noticed she had a small warm book she would read by the firelight in the evenings, her lips sometimes moving silently, and he wondered about the world she came from. He learned that she was afraid of thunderstorms, her composure cracking only when the lightning flashed and the thunder shook the cabin. During one such storm he stayed inside, cleaning his rifle, his steady presence a silent reassurance, until it passed. She in turn learned him. She saw the deep sadness that settled in his eyes when he looked at the small empty rocking chair. She saw the calloused strength in his hands and the gentleness with which he treated his animals. She learned the rhythm of his moods from the set of his shoulders or the way he walked. She understood that his silence was not a rejection, but a shield for a wound that had never healed. One evening he returned from a long day to find she was not in the cabin. A flicker of cold panic, an emotion he thought long dead, shot through him. He found her in the meadow gathering wildflowers. She had arranged them in an old tin can on the table. The vibrant blues and yellows were a shock of life in the Spartan room. They were beautiful. And for the first time he saw her smile, a small, hesitant curve of her lips as she looked at her simple bouquet. In that moment the cabin felt less like a shelter and more like a home. The shared solitude was no longer empty. The first hint of winter came not as a gentle dusting of snow, but as a sudden sharp-toothed wind that clawed at the cabin and screamed through the pines. Abel felt it in his bones, an old and familiar warning. He spent 2 days securing the homestead, banking dirt against the foundation, checking the seals on the barn, and ensuring the livestock had enough feed to last a long storm. May worked alongside him, her small frame surprisingly strong, as she helped him haul water and stack the last of the firewood inside. The storm hit on the 3rd day. It came without preamble, a wall of white that descended from the peaks and swallowed the world. The temperature plummeted. The wind howled with a malevolent personal fury, rattling the door in its frame and driving snow through the smallest cracks in the chinking. The world beyond their single window vanished into a churning vortex of white. They were trapped. The cabin, once a refuge, now felt like a small fragile ship on a vast and violent sea. Abel had seen storms like this before. He knew their power. His primary concern was a new calf, born just the day before to one of his best heifers. He had to check on them, ensure the mother hadn't rolled on the newborn in the cramped space of the barn. "Stay inside," he told May, his voice firm as he pulled on his heaviest coat and wrapped a scarf around his face. "Keep the fire high." She nodded, her eyes wide with a fear she tried to conceal. The short distance to the barn was a treacherous journey. The wind tore at him, stealing his breath and driving ice crystals into his exposed skin. He fought his way through waist-deep drifts, the familiar landscape rendered alien and hostile. He found the cow and her calf safe, huddled in the back of their stall. He checked them over, added fresh straw, and then fought his way back. By the time he stumbled back into the cabin, he was a creature of ice. Snow was caked on his eyebrows and beard, and a deep, shuddering chill had settled deep in his bones. May helped him out of his frozen coat, her expression tight with worry. He collapsed into a chair by the fire, exhausted, but the warmth of the flames couldn't seem to penetrate the cold that had taken root in his chest. By nightfall, he was shivering uncontrollably, and a dry, rasping cough had started. May knew this fever. She had seen it in her village, a fire that burned from the inside out. She acted with a swift, desperate competence. She piled every blanket they owned onto him and kept the fire roaring, the heat in the small cabin becoming almost unbearable. She melted snow for water, forcing him to drink. The cough worsened, and his breathing grew shallow and labored. He was slipping away from her, drifting into a delirium where he muttered names she didn't know. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice a broken rasp. "The boy! Need more blankets, Sarah." Mai felt a pang of sorrow for this unknown woman, for the ghost that haunted the corners of this small cabin. She leaned close, wiping his brow with a cool, damp cloth. "Abel," she said, her voice soft but firm, "you must fight. Stay here." She remembered the small silk pouch she had carried with her all the way from her home. Inside was a collection of dried herbs, a gift from her grandmother, a woman skilled in the old ways. She recognized the signs of lung fever and knew what was needed. She brewed a dark, bitter tea, the strange, earthy scent filling the room. She cradled Abel's head, coaxing the hot liquid past his lips, a spoonful at a time. For 2 days and 2 nights she held her vigil. The storm raged outside, a mirror of the battle raging inside him. She did not sleep, sustained by coffee and a fierce, protective will. She sat by his side, listening to his ragged breaths, her quiet presence a constant anchor in the fevered storm of his mind. In those long, dark hours, the walls between them, built of silence and caution, crumbled into dust. She was no longer a cook he had hired, and he was no longer a stranger who had offered shelter. She was fighting for his life. On the morning of the 3rd day, the storm broke. The wind died down, and a pale, watery sunlight filtered through the snow-caked window. At the same moment, Abel's fever broke. The shivering stopped, and he fell into a deep, natural sleep. His breathing was still rough, but it was steady. Mai sagged with relief, an exhaustion so profound it was a physical pain washing over her. She watched him sleep, his face pale and gaunt in the morning light, the harsh lines softened by vulnerability. She had saved him. When he finally awoke, his mind was clear. He felt weak, as if he'd been hollowed out, but he was alive. He saw her sitting in the chair beside his bed, her face etched with fatigue. He saw the empty cup and smelled the lingering scent of the strange tea. He knew, with a certainty that went beyond words, that she had pulled him back from the edge. "You stayed," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Yes," she answered simply. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, with the world outside muffled and white, the silence in the cabin was different. It was filled with a new intimacy, the kind forged only in a shared struggle against death. Later that day, as he sat propped up by the fire, sipping a broth she had made, he found himself speaking. The words came haltingly at first, then with a steady, cathartic flow. He told her about Sarah, his childhood sweetheart, a woman with a laugh like wind chimes and hands that could make anything grow. He told her about their son, Daniel, a boy with his mother's smile and a wild, joyful spirit. He spoke of the fever that had swept through the valley 5 years before, a relentless plague that had taken them both within a week, leaving him alone in a house that was no longer a home. He spoke of the empty rocking chair, the one he'd built for Sarah to soothe their son to sleep in, and how he couldn't bring himself to get rid of it. He talked more in that single hour than he had in the past 5 years combined, laying the ghost of his grief bare in the warm, quiet air. When he was finished, a profound silence fell. May listened without interruption, her gaze filled with a deep, compassionate understanding. Then she told him her story. She spoke of her family in a province by the sea, of a father who was a scholar and a mother who painted beautiful scrolls. She told him of political turmoil, of famine, of a family honor destroyed by debts they could not pay. She had been the price of that debt, sold into a contract that promised her to an American merchant, a man of supposed wealth and standing. That man was Bartholomew Thorne. "He promised my father a new life for me," she said, her voice low and steady, devoid of self-pity. "He wanted a possession, not a wife, a symbol of his power. When he found I had a mind of my own, he grew angry. When I would not submit to his cruelties, he grew to hate me." She looked at her hands, then back at him. "He told me I was not made for this hard land. He was wrong. I was made to survive." In that moment, Abel saw her not just as a survivor, but as a warrior, her spirit as unyielding as the mountains around them. Their past were different worlds apart, but their wounds were the same. They were both haunted by loss, both survivors of a world that had tried to break them. The bargain they had made in the rain-soaked street of Redemption Gulch was no longer a simple contract of labor for shelter. It had been forged into something far deeper in the crucible of the storm. The spring thaw came late that year, a slow, grudging retreat of winter. The snow melted, and the high meadow came alive with the vibrant green of new grass and the bold colors of wildflowers. A sense of peace settled over the homestead, a quiet rhythm of shared work and growing companionship. Abel's strength returned, and with it a lightness he hadn't felt in years. He found himself smiling at the way May would talk to the small garden she had planted, coaxing the tender shoots from the soil. She, in turn, seemed to shed the last of her fear, her laughter sometimes gracing the cabin, a sound as clear and welcome as a mountain spring. But their sanctuary was fragile, an island of peace in a world governed by men like Bartholomew Thorne. One bright afternoon in late May they saw a rider approaching. It was Thorne, dressed in a fine city coat and polished boots that seemed an insult to the rugged landscape. He was not alone. Behind him, looking deeply uncomfortable, rode Sheriff Calloway. He had known this day would come. He wiped his hands on his trousers and stood on the porch, waiting. May came to stand in the doorway behind him, her face calm, but her hands were clenched into tight fists at her sides. Thorne reined in his horse a few yards from the cabin, his lips curled into a condescending smile. He surveyed the tidy homestead, his gaze lingering on May with an owner's possessiveness. "A quaint little setup you have here, Abel," Thorne said, his voice smooth and laced with menace. "I see you've been putting my property to good use." "She's not your property," Abel said, his voice low and even. Thorne chuckled a dry, unpleasant sound. "Oh, but she is. I have a contract signed and sealed by her father, an agreement for passage and marriage, which she in her insolence refused to honor. She is by law my indentured servant until her family's debt is repaid, a debt which I assure you is substantial." He produced a folded document from his coat pocket, waving it like a small flag of victory. Sheriff Calloway shifted in his saddle. "Abel, he's got the paperwork. It looks legal. I've come to make you an offer," Thorne continued, ignoring Calloway. "I am a reasonable man. I'll overlook your transgression. Return her to me, and I'll even pay you for her upkeep. $100, a generous price for a used cook." The insult was deliberate, designed to provoke. Abel's hands tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "She's not for sale." Thorne's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. "I see you choose the hard way, then? Very well." He turned his gaze to the land around them. "It has come to my attention that there is discrepancy in the original survey of this territory, a rather significant one. It seems your claim this very homestead is actually part of a parcel I purchased from the railroad last year. A simple clerical error, of course, but one that will have to be rectified by the courts." The threat was clear and devastating. Thorne couldn't challenge Abel with fists, so he would use his wealth and influence to crush him. He would bury him in legal fees, challenge his land title, and bleed him dry until he had nothing left. "I'll give you 1 week, Abel," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. 1 week to bring her back to town. If you do not, I will file my claim and you will lose everything. This house, this land, all of it." He looked past Abel, directly at May, who stood unflinching in the doorway. "And I will still get what is mine." With that, he wheeled his horse around and rode away, the sheriff following like a reluctant shadow. The ultimatum hung in the suddenly silent air, heavy and poisonous. Abel stood for a long time, staring at the spot where Thorne had been, the vast, beautiful landscape, now seeming fragile and threatened. He had built this life with his own 2 hands, pulled it from the unforgiving earth. It was all he had left of himself. He felt a light touch on his arm. He turned to see May standing beside him, her eyes searching his face. He had every reason to give in. He was one man against Thorne's fortune and influence. Protecting her would cost him everything. She would not have blamed him in her world. Survival often meant making impossible choices. He looked from her face to the cabin, to the barn, to the mountains that had been his only companions for so long. He had offered her shelter, a simple bargain. But it had become more than that. She had brought life back to this place. She had brought life back to him. To send her back to Thorne would be to send her to a life of cruelty and degradation. It would be a betrayal not only of her, but of the man he was trying to be again. He made his decision. It was not a choice between his land and her freedom. It was a choice between living as a coward and living as a man. He turned and looked directly into her eyes, his gaze clear and unwavering. "This is your home," he said, his voice filled with a quiet, unshakable resolve. The words were a promise. They were a declaration of war. He would not bend. He would not break. He would stand and fight. The week passed with the slowness of a coming storm. A heavy tension settled over the homestead, an unspoken understanding that their quiet life was balanced on a knife's edge. Abel spent the days cleaning his rifle, checking his fences, and watching the road, his face a mask of grim determination. May went about her chores with a quiet focus, but he saw the worry in her eyes. They spoke little, but they were a united front, a silent partnership, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. On the seventh day, just as the sun began its descent behind the western peaks, they appeared. It was Thorne and Sheriff Calloway again, but this time they were not alone. 4 grim-faced men, hired muscle from the saloons in town, rode with them. They looked less like a legal party, but another rider had come first. Mr. Henderson, the store owner, had galloped up the trail an hour earlier, his face flushed with exertion and concern. "They're coming, Abel," he panted. "Thorne's got a writ from a circuit judge he keeps on his payroll. He means to take her by force and serve you with an eviction. It ain't right. A few of us, we're not going to stand for it." Henderson had then ridden off, promising to gather what support he could. Abel stood on the porch, his old hunting rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. It was not a threat, but a statement. This was his land, and he would defend it. Mai came out and stood beside him. Not behind him, she wore the simple calico dress she had made, her hands clasped in front of her, her posture radiating a calm defiance that was more powerful than any weapon. Thorne's party reined in, spreading out in a semicircle before the cabin. The hired men looked shifty, their eyes darting from Abel's rifle to the shadows of the forest. Sheriff Calloway looked miserable, a man caught between his duty and his conscience, what little of it remained. "This is your last chance, Abel," Thorne called out, his voice smug with triumph. He held up a piece of paper. "I have a legal writ ordering the seizure of my indentured property, one May Lynn, and a notice of eviction for you for unlawful occupation of my land." Calloway cleared his throat and began to read the writ in a monotone voice, the legal jargon sounding absurd in the vast wilderness. As he spoke, Abel saw more riders emerge from the trees behind Thorne's men. It was Henderson, along with 3 other ranchers from the valley, hard, quiet men who disliked Thorne's arrogance and his attempts to own the entire territory. They didn't draw their weapons, but simply sat on their horses, watching their presence, shifting the balance of power. Thorne's face tightened in annoyance at the sight of them, but he pressed on. "The law is on my side. Now step aside and let my men retrieve what's mine." "I am not a thing to be retrieved," a clear voice rang out. It was May. She stepped forward slightly, her chin held high. Her voice did not tremble. "I am not property. I am a person. Mr. Thorne brought me here with lies. He promised me a life as a wife, but he treated me as a slave. This man," she turned and gestured to Abel, "has shown me only respect. He has given me a home," Thorne sneered. "Your feelings are irrelevant. The contract is all that matters." Abel looked at May, at the fierce, unbreakable spirit in her eyes. He looked at Thorne's cruel, possessive face. He looked at the uncertain sheriff and the silent, watching ranchers. Everything had come down to this moment. The law was a tool for the rich, and his land was just paper in a courthouse. But there was a higher law, a law of the heart, a law of what was right. He knew what he had to do. The words came to him simple and absolute, the only truth that mattered in this world. He took a step forward, placing himself slightly in front of May, a human shield. He looked directly at Sheriff Calloway, past Thorn, speaking not to his enemy but to the law. His voice was not loud, but it carried with the weight of an oath across the silent meadow. "She is my wife." The words fell into the tense silence like stones into a still pond. Calloway's mouth dropped open. Thorn's face went from smug triumph to slack-jawed disbelief, then to a dark, mottled rage. The hired men exchanged confused glances. Henderson and the other ranchers looked on with newfound respect. In that territory, at that time, a public declaration of marriage, made before witnesses, held the full force of a legal bond. It was a frontier necessity, a verbal contract that was as binding as any license from a faraway government. With those 4 words, Abel had completely changed the legal reality. May was no longer an indentured servant or a piece of property subject to Thorn's contract. She was a homesteader's wife, with all the rights and protections that entailed Thorn's writ, was now worthless. "You're lying," Thorn sputtered, his voice cracking with fury. "This is a trick. Is it, Sheriff?" Abel asked, his gaze locked on Calloway. "You are a witness. These men are witnesses. I have declared my intent. She stands with me. We are man and wife." Calloway looked from Abel's unyielding face to Thorn's sputtering rage. He saw the ranchers watching him, their expressions hard. For the first time, the sheriff made a choice that wasn't dictated by Thorn's money. "The law's the law, Thorn," he said, his voice regaining a measure of authority. "A public declaration it stands. This is a domestic dispute now. My authority here is done." "You useless coward!" Thorn shrieked. He turned to his hired men. "Get her! I'll pay you double!" But the men hesitated. Attacking a homesteader and his wife on their own land, in front of witnesses, was a different business than bullying a lone woman. It was a hanging offense. Before they could decide, Abel raised his rifle, the movement fluid and certain. The ranchers behind Thorn subtly shifted, their hands moving closer to their own sidearms. Outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and with his legal authority evaporated, Thorn was defeated. His power, built on paper and fear, had crumbled in the face of a simple, profound truth. He stared at Abel and May, his face a mask of pure hatred. "This isn't over," he snarled. But the threat was hollow. He had lost. He yanked on his horse's reins, wheeling the animal around so sharply it reared and galloped back down the trail, his men trailing behind him like defeated dogs. Sheriff Calloway gave Abel a long, complicated look, then tipped his hat in a gesture of grudging respect and followed them. The last of the riders disappeared into the twilight, leaving behind a profound and ringing silence. The aftermath of the confrontation was as quiet as the climax had been tense. Henderson and the other ranchers rode forward. Henderson reached out and shook Abel's hand firmly. "That was a good thing you did, Abel, a right thing." The other men nodded their agreement, their faces expressing a deep communal respect. They offered a few quiet words of support, promised to keep an eye out for any further trouble, and then they too departed, melting back into the landscape and leaving the homestead to its peace. Abel and May were left alone on the porch as twilight settled, painting the sky in soft shades of purple and orange. Air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. The threat was gone. The words Abel had spoken, "She is my wife," seemed to hang in the air between them, a tangible presence. He had said them to save her, to win a battle, but as he looked at her now, standing so steadfastly beside him, he knew he had spoken a deeper truth. He lowered the rifle and leaned it against the cabin wall. He was suddenly aware of how close she was standing, the warmth of her shoulder almost touching his. He could not read the expression on her face in the fading light. He had made a declaration for her, about her, without her consent. He had bound her to him with a public oath, perhaps trapping her in a different kind of cage. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice quiet. "I had no right to say that without asking. It was the only way I could think to stop him." She turned her face toward him. "You had every right," she said, her voice soft but certain. "You fought for my home. You fought for me." They stood in silence for a few moments more, the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The cabin behind them was a warm, welcoming shape, a true sanctuary now defended and secured. Finally, he led the way inside. That evening they sat by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the log walls. The silence was different again. Was not the silence of strangers, nor the easy silence of routine. It was a silence of contemplation, of a threshold crossed. The world had been altered, and they were sitting in the quiet center of that new world. Abel looked at her, at the way the firelight caught the curve of her cheek, and the deep, intelligent darkness of her eyes. He thought of the long, empty years behind him, and the unexpected fragile hope of the future. He had to know if the words he had spoken were a lie or a prophecy. "What I said," he began, his voice rough with emotion, to the sheriff. "I meant it, if you'll have it, if you would have me." It was the most he had ever offered another person. His heart laid bare in the simple, clumsy words. May looked away from him, her gaze fixed on the mesmerizing dance of the flames. She thought of her long journey, of the betrayals and the hardships. She thought of this quiet, stoic man who had offered her a bargain and had, in the end, given her everything. He had offered her safety, given her respect, and risked all he had to defend her dignity. Here, in this small cabin in the vast wilderness, she had found not just a refuge. She did not speak. Instead, she reached out and gently placed her hand over his, her small, slender fingers covering his calloused, powerful ones. Her touch was an answer, a promise, an acceptance more profound than any word. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. Their hands joined in the warm firelight. "I have a home," she whispered, and it was all he needed to hear. The story did not end there, but it was where the new beginning was truly forged. Weeks later, the meadow was a riot of summer green, and the garden May had planted was thriving. They worked together, falling into a new rhythm, the easy, comfortable partnership of a husband and a wife. He taught her how to read the sky for weather, and she taught him the names of the constellations her father had shown her. The small, empty rocking chair by the hearth was no longer a monument to a ghost. Sometimes in the evening she would sit in it, mending his shirts, bringing it back to life. One evening, as the sun set in a spectacular blaze of color, Abel finished his work at the corral and walked toward the cabin. He saw May in her garden, kneeling, her hands in the rich earth, tending to the new green shoots. A gentle breeze lifted a strand of her dark hair. He stopped and watched her, a feeling of peace so deep it was almost painful settling in his chest. He thought of the broken man who had ridden down to Redemption Gulch for supplies, and the whole man who now stood on this land. She had not just saved his life from a fever, she had saved his soul from a long, cold winter. He walked over and stood beside her. She looked up at him and smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her whole face. She stood and they looked out together, not at the past that haunted them, but at the vast, promising horizon. Their land, their home, their future. A new life, built on a foundation of courage and kindness, taking root in the heart of the unforgiving frontier.